Good morning, good afternoon. I'm José Pio Borges, Chairman of the Board of Trustees of SEBRE, the Brazilian Center for International Relations. And it's a pleasure to welcome you to today's event, a partnership between SEBRE and the Bank of Communications, BBM Bocom. This webinar is organized by SEBRE, Asia program. And today we have the pleasure of having as a guest Parag Khanna, who will be properly introduced by Tatiana. I have to mention, though, that when Ana Jaguaribe and Tatiana Rosita created the Asia program within SEBRE, Parag's book, The Future is Asian, was a major inspiration. And not only was it an inspiration, but was prophetic, because at that time, China had already become Brazil's largest trading partner. But ever since, in 2021, for example, when Brazil's trade with the world was around $500 billion, Brazil's exports to China were larger than the combined US, European Union, and Mercosur together. Also, not only China, uh, Brazil's exports to Asia, excluding China and Japan, the two largest economies in Asia, were larger than the exports to the US and also larger than the exports to the European Union. So this, what Parag mentioned in his book has become true for Brazil and for Latin America. Uh, I have here with us uh, Alexandre Loventron, who is the executive president of BBM Bocom, our partners in sponsoring the Asia program. Tatiana Rosito, senior fellow of SEBRE, diplomat, former representative of Petrobras in Beijing, consultant to the New Development Bank now, and Parag Khanna, who will be introduced by Tatiana. But now I pass the floor to Alexandre to do his welcoming words. Alexandre, please.
Good morning, everyone. Good evening, Parag. I must say that I'm very, very happy to be part of this event. And also, as Pio said, we're very happy to be celebrating this year more than five years of this partnership with SEBRE. I would say a very successful partnership where we support mainly Asia Group and the China group study, which we believe, given the importance of Asia, not only for the world, but especially for Brazil, as the numbers that Pio has put show very clearly, is very understanding to understand where we are moving, what are the challenges ahead. So many interesting and thoughtful debates and connections with Asia institutions and individuals has been produced over those times through SEBRE's competence. And in this journey of better understanding those trades that we face ahead and that has been going on, we're very happy to interact for the first time with one of the main experts on the subject. And as people said, even one of the most influential contributors and author of, among many other contributions that Tatiana will put, the book, The Future is Asia, Commerce and Conflict and Culture in the 21st Century, where he very interesting analyzes the shift in global power allocation from the West to Asia. So without further ado, I will pass to Tatiana so that Dr. Parag can answer to us what we're very eager to hear. I mean, it's very hard from the time first the the book was published to foresee so many important, significant shocks the world economy and political atmosphere has suffered. So, Parag, we are eager to hear from you what has been changing in this view of Asian future since so many important shocks and important policy reactions, both economically and political. So without further ado, Tatiana, thank you very much, and thanks all for being part of today's seminar.
Thank you, Alexandre. Thank you, Pio and Alexandre, for your references and introduction. Very happy to be here. We have been meaning to have Parag with us since we created the group with Anna in 2017, but certainly since 2020. In terms of timing, though, I think this is maybe the perfect time. We didn't plan for that totally, but it's the perfect time for putting geography and geopolitics in a way back here in our focus. Just now a formal introduction. Parag, it's our honor to have you today. Parag is a leading global strategist, world traveler, best-selling author. His two last, and also the founder and the manager of Future Map. So he deals with big data analytics just to see where the world is going. He's the author of many books, but the two last one, Move, The Forces Uprooting Us, and as mentioned before, The Future is Asian. Parag was named one of Esquire's 75 most influential people of the 21st century, featured in Wired magazine's Smart List. He has been advisor also to the United States government and to many different companies and institutions in building strategic scenarios. At this very moment, as I said, of primacy of maybe geography and geopolitics, again, we're very happy to hear from you, Parag. Please, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, everyone. Such a pleasure to join you. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, or wherever you may be. I don't think that one generation ago a global conversation like this could be hosted in every corner of the world. But the fact that it's happening now is itself significant, and I'm very pleased that it's happening out of Brazil, of course, which is punching above its weight. And fortunately, that extends over Zoom, even though we can't be together in person. So thank you, Tatiana. Thank you, Alexandre. Thank you, Jose, for this invitation. It's a pleasure to join you. I know we don't have a lot of time, but I do want to share some ideas, some slides that can help to structure the conversation today. There's, of course, many reasons to believe that the world is full of uncertainty and chain reactions and complexity, and therefore we cannot make any solid predictions about the future. But perhaps the one thing that we can think of as solid ground, pardon the pun, is geography. And for me, geography is not necessarily destiny, but it's a very important indicator of where things are going when we're trying to map out the future of geopolitics. And surprisingly, despite this connected world, it could be that geography is returning in a very profound way in terms of shaping our economic and geopolitical systems. So with that in mind, let me begin and move forward through the presentation. First, I want to point out that we do live in a world that is quite manifestly and irrevocably multipolar. Many people over the last 20 years have wondered when the world would be multipolar. In the context of my work, I have found that the world is already multipolar going back 15, almost 20 years, which is why when I first started coming to Brazil in the mid-2000s and looking at the intensifying relationships between Brazil and Asia, that to me was an indication of the world's shifting alignments. Now, what you're seeing here is the world economy is organized according to purchasing power parity terms. And the fact that every region has a different color coding indicates, of course, their overall size. But what you see is that North America, Europe, and Asia dominate the world economic landscape very, very clearly. And that the Asian economies benefit significantly from this upward revision of GDP calculation based upon purchasing power parity. Now, I'll present in a couple of slides how you will see that really it should be that way that we measure in PPP terms, because Asians increasingly produce their own goods and services with imports from Asia, using Asian labor and trading with other Asians. And therefore, PPP measurement becomes increasingly relevant. But again, you can see the clear hierarchy, if you will, an economic, regional tripolarity: North America, Europe, Asia, and of course, South America is here, Africa is here, Middle Eastern countries are here, but in PPP terms, the hierarchy becomes that much more evident. Now, one of those regions, Europe, is losing in terms of its relative share of global GDP. That has led many people to discount the importance of Europe. I've always felt that Europe, because of its geography, because of its economic size, because of its population size, its innovation, its regulatory power and influence, remains a global player in many ways. Let's look at the implications of the Russian invasion of Ukraine in that regard. Now, what you know is that Europe has decided to accelerate its plans to diversify its energy dependence on Russia. This is a map that I made some years ago that looks at the energy grid, particularly oil and gas pipelines within Europe. Now, as you know, Europe is now looking at more Arctic oil and gas supply, more North African supply, more Persian Gulf supply, maybe even Iran, in order to accelerate that diminishing of dependence on Russia. It will also, of course, double down and accelerate its efforts to integrate more renewable energy. So this certainly means a greening of Europe. And one of the lessons of geopolitics that we need to take into account right now is that to be a winner in geopolitics does not necessarily mean that you have conquered the largest territory. That's a very 19th century view. In fact, actually, also in the 19th century, one of the key traditions in geopolitics was not necessarily about expansionism, but it was about self-sufficiency. And what Europe is doing now is accelerating its efforts at energy self-sufficiency and other kinds of self-sufficiency, which will actually be crucial to enhance its fundamental power dynamics in the years ahead. But on the other side of this map, of course, you have Russia. So the question becomes, well, where does Russia fit in this picture? Now, if Russia is losing its largest foreign investor, which is Europe, and its trade relations are increasing with Asia, and it will be increasingly dependent on Asia to export its hydrocarbons and also to import goods, whether it's electronics, machinery, and so forth. Clearly, what you have is an acceleration of Russia's tilt towards Asia. Now, one of the things that I've been pointing out for close to 15 plus years, when I write about Russia, I more or less refer to it as North Asia. And that's what Russia effectively is geographically. But we know that culturally and diplomatically and strategically, we more often than not treat Russia as an Eastern European country. That's the way it's diplomatically grouped and so forth. I think, of course, one significant consequence of this war is that perhaps once and for all, although I'll never say forever, we will start to treat Russia as North Asia. And that's effectively what it's becoming when you think about the last 20 years, really under Putin, the tilt towards Asia in trade, in energy, in commodities. And of course, what you've seen in the Ukraine war is that Asian countries, both democracies and non-democracies, both China and India, have been much more accommodating of Russia's actions. They have not really participated in the sanctions fully. The latest data tells us that the ruble renminbi trade, the ruble rupee trade have all expanded. So clearly we will see a one-directional continuation, I think, of this trend of Russia becoming ever more embedded in the Asian system. And when I say Asian system, what I mean is that after, after 500 years of colonialism and the Cold War, right? 500 years in which Asian powers were not really integrated with each other and not even all that interdependent with each other, that Asian system has been recovering over the past 30 years since the collapse of the Soviet Union. And if you look at this data, if you go back to 2005, 2010, 2015, 2020, every one of these lines has been getting thicker, right? Which is to say that you have an ever more intense set of relations on the economic and commercial domain between all of the sub-regions and pairs of countries in Asia. And it's a remarkable recovery. Asians now have 60% or more of their total trade with other Asians, right? And with the passage of the signing of the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, the RCEP, this is the largest trade liberalization zone in the entire world. That will increase further. In fact, we do tend to underestimate the impact that free trade agreements have over time on locations. So it will probably be even more significant than what you have read about. Note also that China's trade with ASEAN bilaterally is larger than its trade with the United States. And China's largest trading partner is, of course, the European Union. So from the Chinese point of view, building these Eurasian connections, if you will, is critical. Now, you can see that manifest in a number of ways. I've broken down the aggregate data according to various functional categories, thematic categories, like energy and food. So quickly, I'll show you here the top 3 energy trading partners for each Asian country already tend to be each other. Now, this began with the commodities super cycle of the 1990s, in which Brazil also participated, but the Gulf countries were the immediate prime beneficiaries because their oil and gas exports began to tilt much more towards India, China, Japan, and so forth. So this is just the energy picture. And of course, again, if you look at what's happening with pipeline projects across the Belt and Road countries of Eurasia and other power generation, including long distance electricity lines and so forth, there's an Asianization of the Asian energy grid. In food, which is of course one of the critical themes right now, given the supply chain disruptions, there is a growing, again, mutual dependency here. Again, top 3 crops produced and top 3 food trade partners among Asian countries also tend to be each other. Now, there are moments like the combination of COVID, border issues, droughts, and the Ukraine war that cause immense stress in some of these dependencies. So we know, for example, that in North Africa and even in Southeast Asia, there's concerns about the stability of food supply from key trading partners. But if you strip out the sort of short-term factors there, like the Ukraine war or like one particular seasonal drought or something like that, again, you have a clear pattern of efforts at increasing food production in Asia and building out the infrastructure of trade to enhance diversification of food trade in the region. So I call this the Belt and Road for food. And of course, Brazil, Argentina, other countries are participants in the energy, the commodities, and the food trade, among others, all the way across the Pacific Ocean with this zone. So it's important for you, of course, on the other side of the world. And by the way, I think that there is no further place away from Singapore in the world than Brazil. So it's a really appropriate conversation and linkage that we have here. This is the Asian system that you are plugging into, as are others. Now, going back to the big picture, as I emphasized at the beginning, this is a unique moment in history where every region of the world does matter. Yes, there is still a hierarchy to some degree, but what is different in the current structure of world order that's different from previous generations is that rather than presume that one hegemonic system is succeeded by another hegemonic system, in other words, Pax Americana gives way to Pax Sinica, I don't believe that that will happen. In my diagram here, you do not see any power at the center. You do not see the United States at the center. You do not see China at the center. No one power has systemic coercive capability. right? There are obviously ways in which the United States remains very powerful, very influential, but fully decisive and determinative on a global scale, obviously that's not the case, as we can see right now playing out, and as quite frankly, as we have for the past 20 years in other contexts, such as the Middle East and so forth. So every region matters, and no one power has full blocking capability. Instead, you see a spider web, a lattice. Every region can connect with, trade with, exchange with every other region in the world. And indeed, again, Brazil and its growing relations with Asian countries, the multilateral institutions that you have formed and worked with, amongst BRICS members, New Development Bank, and so forth, your participation with China in these institutions, your increasing ties to African nations and so forth are all examples of this. And everyone else is doing that too. So rather than think of the world as a succession of hierarchies, I think of this new permanent structure that is multi-regional, multi-civilizational, and these regions can form reciprocal ties with each other, focused on complementarity. At the end of the day, it's about complementarity. Whether it is in security goods, whether it's infrastructure, finance, whether it is environmental stewardship and technology, whether it is capital flows, whether it's technology, medical equipment, and so on and so forth, there is a global marketplace for these goods and services, and everyone can be an active participant in that. And again, there is no one coercive central power. So what we have to think of the new sort of structure is one that is open, that is multi-regional, and each country that has the capacity to be a utility provider, right, to be a service provider, is competing in that marketplace. And I believe this is a very rigid, if you will, structure, in the sense that I do not see a decline and disappearance of the United States, nor of Brazil, nor of China, nor of Europe, right? There may be relative power shifts, but in an absolute sense, each remains sufficiently powerful to have global influence and connectivity with each other. If anything, the number of states with that capacity is growing, not receding, which is why I focus on Asia, and Asia being multipolar within a multipolar world. So you have a multipolar world and a multipolar Asia. Within that world, I think, is the correct way to understand this. And let's remember that the United States after World War II represented 50%, 50% of the world economy. China today is only 15%, right? So we do live in a fundamentally multipolar world. That said, where China has excelled is in trade and supply chains, right? Because it has grown faster in the last 40 years than any other economy and become the world's largest economy in PPP terms, a lot of it has been driven by the international network. So China is still the largest trading partner in many countries. The fact that it has supported the regional comprehensive economic partnership, the Belt and Road Initiative, the policy of dual circulation, all have been attempts to ensure the stability of its necessary commodities and intermediate goods imports, as well as the export of goods around the world. Now, we'll see a rise and decline in some of these areas. There are definitely areas where China's imports from, say, certain African countries will go down because it is now procuring those materials from elsewhere, such as, for example, Russia. So China invests in a global redundant capacity to ensure the stability of supply. But that doesn't mean that we can paint a straight line between its investments and trade in a place right now and the future stability of strategic relationships. In fact, we already see a number of countries that are pushing back against debt trap diplomacy and excessive dependence on China. But that said, this is where things stand at the moment. Now, another reason not to overemphasize China alone when we look at the future of Asia is that Asia has gone through multiple waves of growth in the last since the end of World War II. And in truth, China is the third of those waves. It is not the beginning or the end of the Asian story. And that's the way many people make it out to be. And that is the kind of assumption that I'm always arguing against. because in reality, Japan was the first wave of Asian growth. Then came the tiger economies. Then came China, starting in the 1980s, but particularly in the 1990s and 2000s. And now we have a fourth wave of Asian growth, which is the countries of South and Southeast Asia, the countries in yellow. Now, the demographics of this story are incredible because the combined population of these fourth wave countries is 2.5 billion people. Now, it's not one country, relatively contiguous societies, but they are all younger than China. Every single one of them has a younger median age than China, and in some cases much younger, like India, and the average across Southeast Asia is 30 years of age. So you have 2.5 billion, mostly young people in these more open and fast-growing economies, and therefore that constitutes the fourth wave of growth. They are a very important, not only anchor or pillar of the overall Asian story, they also benefit from the previous waves. We should not understand Asia as a set of blocks, a Japan bloc, a China bloc, an India bloc, an ASEAN bloc. Yes, of course, they have political differences, they have huge geopolitical tensions. However, at the same time, Japan and the tiger economies were the biggest investors in China's rise. And today, Japan and the tiger economies and China are the biggest investors and trading partners in these fourth wave economies. So we must understand Asia as a set of sequential and mutually reinforcing waves of growth, despite the tensions among them. This is really, really critical. So think of Asia as a big sponge, not as a block or set of blocks. Some of the evidence of that is here in terms of what is going right in the fourth wave economies in Asia in general, which is that debt, particularly sovereign debt, is being converted into productive capacity, into infrastructure investment. And here, this countries in orange towards the middle at the bottom, those are particularly the Asian economies that are doing the best job of keeping government debt levels down while increasing their fixed capital formation ratio, their fixed investment as a share of GDP, which is a very important metric of your capacity of your economy to meet its potential. Now, you can see China, for example, being way off to the right there, and what South and Southeast Asian countries are doing are moving their way off that way. Now, of course, as we know, in the case of Brazil and Argentina, borrowing has not sufficiently been translated into infrastructure and social spending and the kind of counter-cyclical economic diversification that Brazil needs. Whereas I'm very, very, very optimistic about the South and Southeast Asian countries because of where they are placed, if you will, on this chart. And most of their borrowing, I might add now, is in local currency. And this is critical in a rising interest rate environment, that Asian countries have the credibility in debt markets to borrow in their own currency at a long maturity. So this is a key economic issue. The other is how geopolitics is reinforcing the growing centrality of South and Southeast Asia in global production supply chains. This is one chart from a study that we did in my organization, looking at the outflow or relocation of manufacturing facilities in areas like electronics, apparel, automotive, and industry out of China from firms that are Japanese or European, Korean, or American. So large Western or developed world multinationals coming out of China, and you can clearly see Vietnam and India and Thailand and so forth being very significant beneficiaries of this. And again, this is how China benefited in the 80s and 90s. Now this process is accelerating in this region of the world with such a large, again, and young population. Final points I want to make, this is a bit of a non sequitur, but we certainly do need to take climate change into account in all of this. And I worry a lot, of course, about this. This is a big theme in the MOVE book, is the global adaptation of our human geography to climate change. Now, many of you have seen this map. It's the suitability index, the changing habitability of various geographies in light of rising temperatures, 1.5 degrees, 2 degrees, maybe unfortunately and tragically 3 degrees. what does it do to the capacity of a place or ability of humans to stay in those places? Now you can see this is very problematic for South America, for the southern United States, for South Asia, which is again the most populous region of the entire world. And you may have seen that just 3-4 weeks ago, the heat waves in India and in Pakistan, in the newspapers and on television, you saw maps like this. They were saying this is the heat in India today. So on the one hand, this is a forecast of what is happening at a global trend level. On the other hand, this was last month. So we have to be very, very concerned about our adaptation. And in climate diplomacy, where Brazil at various times has been a strong player, exhibiting leadership, sometimes more than others, certainly now a little bit less. But in climate diplomacy, we have put way more emphasis on mitigating climate change, so reducing emissions, greening supply chains, decarbonizing industry. That's where 90% of our investment has gone. And eventually it will bear fruit, but it has not yet, right? We know that 2021 had the highest emissions and accumulation of carbon emissions output in the atmosphere of any year ever. So we are not exactly going to meet, the Paris targets at this rate. We need to invest more in adaptation. And adaptation can be everything from planting coastal mangroves against sea level rise. It can be retrofitting our buildings. It can be trying to reduce the urban temperature from excessive built up concrete environments. It can also be population relocation. And this to me is a very, very important theme that I've been doing a lot of work on and looking at what the future human geography will be. If people move from coastal areas to inland areas, from low-lying areas to higher elevation, from hotter areas to more temperate areas, what will be the new map of human geography? And that's something that every country has to think about, every region has to think about, every continent has to think about. And that, of course, does, for better or worse, apply as much to really every single part of the world. There are climate migrants in Australia. There are climate migrants in the United States. There are climate migrants in Brazil. There are climate migrants across Asia. To bring it back to Asia, to make a final point, I began by talking about sort of the complexity of the world. And here's one of the things that becomes apparent when you look at the world through a complexity lens. The rise of Asia, the economic rise of Asia, is also the largest new contributor to greenhouse gas emissions and to temperature rise and to sea level rise. And Asia has the most people who are exposed to sea level rise, and therefore is going to cause the largest number of climate migrants. So as I say in the MOVE book, the rise of Asia is causing the sinking of Asia. And that is the kind of complexity thinking that we need if we want to fully understand what lies ahead, not just from a geopolitical standpoint, but factoring in climate change, demographics, infrastructure investment, supply chains, and economics. And it's that kind of holistic thinking, quite frankly, that we depend on institutions like CEBRI to deliver, which is why I'm very pleased to engage in this conversation with you that is really looking at the future through a holistic and interdisciplinary lens and looking at the connectivity and the implications of connectivity across our regions, across our continent. So with that, let me stop. And again, thank you so much for allowing me to join you today, and I look forward to our conversation.
Thank you very much, Parag, for this very insightful yet concise presentation. Just to resume Asia and the future in a few slides, it's very difficult. I would like to take the benefit of kicking off this conversation with a question. I see you started with a focus on geography. And when you talk about geography, many things come to our minds, like resources, be it human or natural resources, our neighbors, right? So our proximate conditions, our climate, of course, more and more, but also access to the sea. And throughout history, or actually we would like to believe that throughout history, man has been able to tame geography in a sense, and to do it, for example, by using technology, right, and means of transportation, and also human capital. So we do have these very more fundamental sources of growth, like geography, and then its impacts through trade and institutions. And then we have the proximate ones, and technology is central. So I would like to understand better in your scenario building, what is the role of technology, especially, having thinking of all that you have presented. It seems that Asia is looking into self-sufficiency. And when we look at China, this is really very much part of the official plans, right? Even though we know it's very difficult, that China will produce all the soybean or the oil that it needs. It's not possible, but it's possible to reduce. And so this is one example for China. And we are large exporters of commodities and those commodities to China. But not only that, we always like to think that, we would like to add value to our exports. And this is our time, because, this is the time of climate change. Brazil has a very clean energy matrix and also is very rich, especially in biodiversity, right? Natural resources. In terms of geography, maybe we can say we are a bit farther from this dynamic axis, but we do have many advantages. So looking into that, what would be the role of technology? How do you frame this in your scenario? And then how we from South America should be penetrating this dynamic axis in Asia?
It's a great question, a very complex, a very rich question, Tatiana. So a couple of things. One is just technologies of connectivity. The fact that countries that are across the Pacific Ocean from each other, the largest barrier to human contact on the planet is the Pacific Ocean. And yet you have growing relations with Asia, and you are a critical supplier of soy, of beef, of many commodities, right, across the Pacific Ocean. So that is also fundamentally about technology. Our transportation technologies are key there, and of course the logistics and the market factors that underpin that are also technologies in some way. Then, of course, then there's a leapfrogging to our digital technology, right, which allows us to have this conversation across the planet. Some of my maps, as you know, focus on internet cables, and I'm always updating that because we're adding new internet cables all the time across the ocean. And the value of the global services economy is catching up to the value of the global goods economy. And that's also a function of technological value added. Now, the fact that countries are seeking greater self-sufficiency is not surprising. Import substitution is one of the classic geopolitical theories. Import substitution is how America became a superpower. Import substitution is how China has become a superpower. So it should not surprise anyone that China has been, accelerating that process, and that the dependency on imports as a share of exports has gone down in China over time. But let's remember that whether it is basic commodities or whether it is high technology, there is a growing market with the growth of the world economy, the growth of the world population, the rise of the global middle class. So there is an ever growing demand for everything from protein to high value added electronic goods. So one has to think about the global marketplace, not just say, China per se or America per se, wherever these demographic trends, productivity growth trends, urbanization trends, youth bulge trends, there are markets that are growing. So even if one place is increasingly attempting, sort of autarky or self-sufficiency, that doesn't mean that the world is becoming, fully, sort of fully regionalized. And indeed, one of the key pillars of resilience is to not be excessively dependent on yourself, because you can become a point of failure of your own, right? Which is not something that China wants to experience, given the higher frequency of droughts that it is experiencing. So China's strategy is not only to potentially regrow soybeans in greater volume, but also, of course, to make sure that it can get them from Brazil and Argentina, and even accelerate the cultivation of soybeans in latitudes and geographies that are becoming more hospitable to that agricultural production. If we were having this conversation 10 years ago or 15 years ago, we would not imagine that Canada and Russia would be two of the world's largest food producers and food exporters. We would not have said, my goodness, we have a global food crisis because of Russia, right? This is not what we used to think of when we think of Russia. So climate change is already kicking in a very major way. So we need to always be nimble and resilient there in terms of that. Then the final point, sorry, just briefly on value added. I mean, of course, this is very critical, but value added comes, of course, from indigenous, or domestic spending on research and development, but also on capturing foreign investment. And one of the things that South American countries can do is well, or both rather, obviously increasing one's investment in R&D, as Brazil does in plant genetics and agricultural value added, and to some degree in energy and so forth, and as Chile is trying to do with its lithium industry to manufacture more batteries for the global electric car industry. That's another example. So every country can do more in terms of domestic investment. The way Chile and other countries are doing it is also to attract more foreign investment in sectors where they can use that investment to rapidly ramp up their innovation and productivity. So I think both strategies are really important.
Thank you. Thank you, Parag. I think I have Pio, his hand is up.
Yes.
Pio, the floor is yours.
Yes, Parag, in his book, Prisoners of Geography by Tim Marshall, he mentions, and I thought it was very curious, that if Peter the Great were alive today, he would move the capital to Vladivostok in the Pacific, following the tilt towards Asia that you mentioned. But you seem to believe, and I would like to, would love it if it were true, that the only consequence of the war in Ukraine was an acceleration of the Russia's tilt towards Asia, and not a division of the world between West and East, or democracies and autocracies, and we and them. Totally, that's like we already live in a multipolar world, and we have to accept that, and we will. There will be no hegemony of one country like the hyper power that existed in the last since the fall of the Soviet Union. And I've been in the US for 2 months, and I see the antagonism between the US, not only with Russia, but with China too, has increased tremendously. It's very difficult to see a Democrat, a Republican, a journalist that would speak in favor of China or Russia, so their own Russia. Even Kissinger, of all people, has become an appeaser now, according to the press. So do you believe that we are, trending to a multipolar world, or a divided world after the war in Ukraine? Thank you.
I think people very significantly overstate the notion of a new Cold War. I do not use this language at all, because as you know very well, the differences between the old and this so-called new Cold War outweigh the similarities. because at the time the world was strictly bipolar and not really multipolar the way it is now. Rather than, and for there, instead of a so-called non-aligned movement, today you have too many countries that are practicing what I call multi-alignment, right? They're not actually choosing sides. Smart countries are not choosing sides at all. They're playing all sides in all directions, and they put themselves at the center. So the notion of a divided world in which you have to choose sides falls apart when you see the actual behavior of most countries, which is to look in all directions and to be friendly with China, friendly with America, friendly with Europe, friendly with Brazil, friendly with Australia, all of this, friendly with Saudi Arabia, and try to juggle all of these things in ways that benefit themselves. So the reality of the world is an opportunistic behavior within a multipolarity in which you have this marketplace of optionality, not a world in which you must choose the RMB or the dollar, you must choose Chinese technology or American technology. That's not the way the world today works at all. At all. And if you look at the ground zero of this supposed competition, which is right here in Southeast Asia, right? Countries like Indonesia, the Philippines, Malaysia, Thailand, the seminal cases right now are not, even though they are geopolitically concerned about China, they've just signed the largest free trade agreement, largest regional trade agreement in all of history with China, right? And so they are taking investment from China, from Chinese technology companies, from Japanese companies, and from American companies at the same time. And why? Because it's good for them, because they want access to capital, they want access to technology, they want access to export markets, and in all directions. So this, to me, sitting here in ground zero, does not look like an iron curtain at all, right? At all. And almost no place in the world actually looks like that. Almost no country I can think of actually picks one or the other in every dimension of their decision-making. So I reject the notion entirely. As a structuralist, again, the economic and strategic underpinnings in terms of economic and military and demographic capacity there's been an entropy, and the world is, again, structurally multipolar and will remain that way. And none of the key players will accept a two-way division of the world. Therefore, it is simply not a divided world, even if we rhetorically present it that way.
Parag, just before passing on to Alexandre, he has his hand on, but just to be a little provocative, what would be actually, what are the real factors behind this, like we do not accept? Because sometimes power is power, right? And then the expression of power at some point may just lead to some degree of acceptance, be it because of financial reasons. You could be financial squeeze, right? In an international financial system still dominated by one currency. You could be squeezed in other ways. So I think that will depend also on the way of, or the degree of decoupling that we see, especially in security and the digital issues. Of course, this may be the reason. Maybe you don't believe in real decoupling. Is that right? What is behind this non-acceptance? What is realistic about saying, no, we do not accept. We today sort of non-aligned, although the context is very different, but what is behind that?
Well, a couple of things, just first on decoupling, right? I mean, if you talk to corporate America, it doesn't really look like a sort of one-directional decoupling. What firms are doing is that their operations in China for the Chinese market remain, because China is a large market for them. So if you're manufacturing automobiles or electronics for the Chinese market, you will do it in China, whether you're Tesla or Apple and so forth. You will also seek to diversify your production and expand into Southeast Asia and India. And that's exactly what's happening. So it's not either or, it's both and. So yes, and that's what is being called friend shoring, and new supply chain alignments. And I support that because the overall contribution that makes is to greater resilience. It creates greater resilience because it creates more distribution of production. Let's take semiconductors. Should the whole world depend on Taiwan for the top quality semiconductor chips? Of course not. So instead, they will now be produced more in Japan, in South Korea, in Taiwan, in eventually India, in Europe, and in the United States. And China also is ramping up its own production. So I don't think that we will have the kind of semiconductor shortage, 2 years, 3 years, whatever crisis comes, that we have experienced in the last year. And I think that's a good thing. So if we talk about decoupling, but what we're actually doing is expanding the geographies of production and creating that resilient capacity instead of depending on just-in-time supply chains or on a single point of failure, that's a good thing, right? So geopolitical tension can produce actually an aggregate public good, right? Which is a resilient system of global production of critical goods. Now, in terms of the multi-alignment, again, even those countries are pursuing very strong industrial policies. If you look at India, for example, they have a very strong Make in India policy. In Thailand, they call it Industry 4.0. They have looked at China's rise, even if they're not authoritarian countries, and they have realized that the fastest way to move up the value chain themselves is to require that foreign investors transfer technology, hire local workers, build low domestic ecosystems so that they can have those spillover effects into their own economy. So really everyone is practicing some kind of industrial policy. And again, I think that's perfectly fair in the interest of national development. It does not follow a certain orthodoxy of free market capitalism with no capital controls and no trade barriers and so forth. But it certainly advances the goal of national development. And the goal of national development accelerates growth, creates a larger middle class, creates jobs, and ultimately winds up in a situation where wealthier countries tend to actually import more and trade more. So it could well be that we'll move back into a world that doesn't really look like this decoupling and new Cold War and regional autarky, but instead there will continue to be a flourishing amount of trade and capital flows and so forth. And that's still the case with capital flows, right? If we look at all of the times in the last 20 years when economists have said that it's the end of globalization, we heard it after the 9/11 terrorist attacks. We heard it after the financial crisis. We heard it after Brexit. We heard it after Trump. We heard it with COVID. 5 times in 20 years, people have said it's the end of globalization. It's the end of global financial flows. It's the end of global trade. And every single time, those people are wrong, right? And they're not even making any reference to the fact that actually look at the huge supply chain bottlenecks because of our dependence on trade. The US trade deficit with China has grown, not shrunk. How can we talk about some kind of instantaneous decoupling? The world is much more tightly interwoven than anyone looking at a simple trade model would like to admit.
Thank you, Parag. It was very compelling. So I'll give the floor to Alexandre Loicron now.
Okay, Tatiana, okay, Parag. Well, first, I must say that your view is very interesting. I kind of agree. And I would say that this multipolar world, in our financial view, we can see also its impacts on the diversification that currencies and companies are having on their strategy. We see central banks all over the world slowly diminishing the role of the US dollar, and which are gaining terrain clearly are the renminbi, the Indian rupee, and the South Korean won. So I would say that I'm sympathetic about this multipolar world, but we can discuss that later. But my question I wanted to pose is for us a longer view scenario and the implications for us in South America, mainly in Brazil, about those prospects of the developing of Asia in the future. you very interestingly put that, well, China is not, the last wave, it's the third wave, and now we'll be moving to a fourth wave where the Southeast Asia will be the center of the development on the years to come. This is also in line with demographics. As we know, the Chinese population will probably peak around 2030. But at the other hand, we are close to 8 billion people in the Earth. We should reach around 10 billion by 2050. And among this 2 billion increase, we'll have 1 billion additional Asians, roughly, and 1 billion additional Africans. My question to you is in this context of this fourth Asian wave and the intersection and the relation that we in Brazil and South America have, which are basically commodity suppliers, mainly commodity suppliers of soybean, iron ore, increasingly oil. I mean, how do you see that changing? Is there, let's say, should we expect some shift on the type of demand of Asia and the financial interactions we have as this fourth wave comes? Okay, thanks so much.
I think you raise an interesting question because, we often take this moment in time in terms of the key outputs from an economy as static. But as I mentioned earlier, all of them are trying to move up the value chain. All of them are accessing capital from different places. They're building up new relationships. You can see the number of European private equity deals here, American private deals here, investments in e-commerce and digital technology here, crypto, blockchain startups here, all of this, and the capital is coming from everywhere. You now have, again, South American countries such as yourselves, Chile, looking beyond China, of course, in terms of their trade relations. And I think that all of that contributes to this much more, nuanced picture of the global relationships that each region has with each other. When it comes to, currencies, there's no question that the economies here in this region, have China mostly as their largest trading partner. It's likely that with the rise of the Chinese central bank digital currency, which is in experimental kind of mode right now, both domestically and internationally, they will increase their share of reserves held in RMB. There's no question there'll be more swap lines among their currencies and central banks. There will be probably some kind of digital regional coin, in ASEAN, and that can be interoperable with the Chinese equivalent. So I think that that's going to have an impact on the landscape. Of course, the US dollar is dominant as a reserve currency right now and a trade settlement currency. I think the trade settlement piece and the reserve piece, have actually been very resilient. But what happens is that in particular cycles, either economic or geopolitical, you start to see that erode. And right now, it seems plausible that we're going to enter another cycle, perhaps a permanent one, in which both as unit of account in trade and as a reserve currency, the dollar will gradually weaken and there'll be more of a diversified kind of regime. More countries clearly are moving towards these trade-weighted reserve baskets. And I think that's, again, a structural trend. It's very highly, highly unlikely that the US will rebound as in terms of volume of trade with individual countries other than Canada and Mexico, because the US itself is trying most of all to trade more with Canada and Mexico in order to diminish its dependence, while you also have a succession of political administrations that refuses to sign new free trade agreements. Plus, you have debt levels skyrocketing, interest rates rising, and then, of course, the punitive use of the dollar that concerns many countries. So if you add all of that up, what you can see is that probably the next few years will be, again, another period in which we have a de-emphasis on the dollar.
Thank you, Parag. I'll now pass on the floor to Eduardo Pfiffer. He is the Executive Manager of Market Intelligence for Vale, the world, one of the world leaders in mining and logistics. Eduardo, the floor is yours. Thank you for being with us today.
Thank you, Tatiana. And Parag, thanks so much for a very inspiring presentation. My question is on the same topic that Alexandre raised about this fourth wave, okay, of countries, and I'll focus mainly on Southeast Asia. So we are noticing in our business various steelmaking facilities being installed here in Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam. So it's really booming. So we have very interesting trend of more capacity being built here in the region. And but one question that interests me is about, let's see, what could be the impacts, for example, if you see this growing geopolitical tensions, if you see, for example, carbon taxes, new carbon taxes, or pandemic controls. How do you see the impact of all these factors affecting the potential growth of Southeast Asia? So how this could impact the overall potential of this fourth wave? So that would be my question for you, Parag.
It's a great question. So the idea of kind of green taxes, border adjustment taxes, Brazil has been a central part of this, in the debate because of the tensions with the European Union around everything from emissions in production to deforestation and so forth. Right now, though, European countries are really bending over backwards to expand their trade and investment linkages with Southeast Asia. They want to have free trade agreements with this region, building upon the one that they already have with Singapore, with Korea, with Japan. The same thing goes to the United States. If you look at the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that was just announced last week by President Biden in Japan, there's very little there in terms of standards, right? The notion that there's going to be an imposition around environmental standards, labor standards, and so forth. They always say that it's on the table, but they will not use it ultimately as a determinative cudgel of leverage, over these developing economies, because they know that these countries will push back against that in the name of their own modernization sort of agenda. So I don't think that right now, even though the regulatory pressures are very strong in Europe and to a much lesser degree in the United States, the exporting of those regulations faces an uphill climb. And therefore, right now, corporations such as yourselves and many other Western global corporations face the difficulty of multiple sets of compliance procedures, right? Because one set of regulations for the US, one set of regulations for Europe. And I think we'll continue to have a bit of that disparate, fragmented regulatory order. Basically, as a friend of mine from PricewaterhouseCoopers says, from PwC, says, we really win. We're really winning right now because all of our customers, all of our clients, who are all of you and every multinational company in the world, has to spend so much more on lawyers and consultants at the moment. And again, I think the incentives to grow trade and boost exports, which are so necessary for European economies, that are all trying to become like Germany, right? Even Germany itself is trying to stay like the Germany we know, which is an export powerhouse. You can't if simultaneously you have non-reciprocal kinds of measures that are penalizing some of your top destination markets. So this is the struggle that they're facing.
Thank you, Parag. I think we also have now Gary Lee from Suzano Asia. Suzano is a leading producer and exporter of pulp. And we're fortunate to have Gary Liu with us today. He is the R&D director for Suzano China. So please, Gary.
Thank you, Tatiana. So first of all, Parag, thank you for the wonderful talk, and you give us a lot of informative and future foreseeing information. So especially your last slide, you show us the heat map of the world, especially in Southeast Asia. So my questions related to this heat map about the global climate change. So we all see that this is one of the challenges for a lot of developing countries, right? So do you see that there's some synergy between Southeast Asia or Asia in general and to Brazil? Because as my understanding, Brazil is very good on like a forest plantation and management. So do you see any opportunities for Brazilian companies or industry in this area trying to help or assist Asia in combating climate change?
It's a great question. So, Southeast Asian countries have been very slow to adopt global standards, whether it's Forestry Stewardship Council or other kinds of supply chain initiatives, or even to comply with any weak domestic regulations. There are no regional ones around ecosystem preservation. And ESG standards are very weak. Again, regulators are more or less absent. So they've been slow to wake up to this. We still see the abuses in the palm oil industry, the deforestation in the Malaysian archipelago in Indonesia remains rampant, and so forth. So there are efforts to use carbon offsets and do reforestation initiatives as part of carbon trading and so forth, to help to create certain financial incentives. There are definitely local pressures, civic pressures, some corporate pressures as well, but we don't yet see the momentum at the domestic level. It's the domestic farmers, the domestic forestry industry and the domestic players that are below the radar, that are less regulated, that are not scrutinized, that are not listed, in London or in Singapore or in New York. Those are the ones that one has to penetrate and get to if you want to have a real impact on this issue. Working, unless of course there are governments that are really standing up and seek to impose really strong national conditions and rules. I think right now across Southeast Asia, you would have to go that top-down route rather than the kind of bottom-up route, if you will. So if you have that ability to transfer that technology, that know-how from Brazil, to countries in the region, I absolutely think that can be a very, very important pillar of bilateral cooperation. And I would hope and pray that that happens, and please do that. But know that the regulatory capacity remains quite low in the developing countries in the region, and there's a lot of entrenched interests that will make it difficult. But that said, there's nothing more important than to try in exactly this area that you are describing.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Sorry.
Yes.
Do you see more? Can you provide a bit more insight for China as well for the climate change? What Brazilian company can do?
Well, in China itself, I mean, on the one hand, it is now a global powerhouse, in clean energy, meaning especially solar, nuclear, hydro, wind, and so on. But it's also mining more coal right now, and as a result of energy supply issues that it's facing. So it's both very green and very dirty at the same time. So in China, you need a sector-specific strategy or even a location-specific strategy. What you see in China, of course, is that different utilities at different provincial levels have different capacities because they have their own energy generation composition and progress towards the renewable energy agenda based upon their local conditions, based upon their finances, and so forth. So you either need a sectoral strategy or a provincial strategy in China. And if I were a clean tech company, or with a certain technology, and I've looked at European firms that are looking at this in China, like for example, Italian firms like Enel, for example, that are very good at renewable energy grids, for example. China is very, very big. So they say, well, what can we do in this city, in this province? What can we do with this set of factories or this industry? And that's the way one has to approach the situation in China.
Thank you.
Thank you, Parag. We count on Suzanne also to move on with this cooperation. A lot of room for that. I perhaps make one last question. We are coming to our, the closing of our event. But Parag, since you are an Indian citizen, although you are a world traveler, a globetrotter, but if you could talk a little bit more about this multipolarity also within Asia, right? We have India and China as both strong partners for in trade, certainly in other groups like the BRICS. We also know they have long-standing issues including border issues. But we also have India in a strategic, like in the Quad. And how does the relationship between China and India could, shape this Asian common economic space?
Mm-hmm. Great point. I'll just share a small anecdote. More than 20 years ago, when I was at the Brookings Institution, we started pulling together for lunches the diplomats from Japan, from Australia, and from India. And people said, well, why these countries? And the joke was, oh, we're building a global NATO. And so that actually was the early seeds of the Quad. And it was track two diplomacy, of course, really, at the time, you might say. It was definitely very, lower level. But you could not at the time, 20 years ago, simply convene the heads of state of Japan, India, Australia, and the United States and not pretend that it was an anti-China coalition. So it took 20 years to evolve to the point that we're at now. And I think it's a lesson, of course, that in taking the long view, first of all. Secondly, a reminder that Asia has these multiple poles of power, that Japan, Australia, India, and others are truly autonomous decision makers, right? They will not simply be pushed over in a unipolar Asian, China-dominated system, not at all, right? And then, of course, you have Russia and Turkey and Iran and other countries that are Indonesia as well, that are stepping up in the regional context. So Asia, again, it's not that China is not the most powerful. Of course it is, right? But that does not mean that it's not a multipolar region at the same time. The powers don't have to be of equivalent power for a system to be multipolar in this Asian system. Then also, of course, there is the strategic coordination, the balancing, the hedging, and this coalitional behavior. And here you see that the Quad countries are providing material resources, training, support to Indonesia, the Philippines, and Vietnam. The RIMPAC naval exercises are coming up and will feature all of these countries. And so I think that there are these dynamics in Asia that very, very strongly indicate an assertion of multipolarity and a desire to have multipolarity as the end state in Asia. And at this point, another difference between 20 years ago and today is that whereas 20 years ago, China was able to project itself and portray itself as a benign power and spoke of peaceful rise and so forth. Well, today, to be honest, nobody believes it, right? To be perfectly blunt, absolutely nobody on the planet Earth believes it. Not even in China, probably, do they believe it. And so that's a very, very big psychological difference. And I think that doesn't mean that we don't do business with China. Everyone does business with China, right? Everyone continues to deal with China. You cannot not reckon with China, work with China, negotiate with China, trade with China, interact with China. Fine, just like we all do with each other in this interdependent marketplace of global diplomacy that we have. But do you have to trust China? No. Do you have to accept China's demands? No. Can you reach out in these coalitions like the Quad to reinforce your point of view and draw a line in the sand the way India has done in their disputes in the Himalayas? Yes, you can. And I think, therefore, the linear projections, even 7 years ago, Tatiana, if we were having this conversation, people said, Belt and Road, this is it. The grand strategy of infrastructure and commerce that will reorganize the planet in China's image, right? Well, 7 years later, that's not what we're saying, right? And so this is, again, all part of the complexity and feedback loops and dynamism of geopolitics. There's China's actions, and then there's the reactions to China's actions. And if you want to understand the future, you don't just look at one force and make a linear projection, you look at the counter reactions and how those affect each other. So 5 years ago, we did not have the Resilient Supply Chain Initiative, the Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, the connectivity corridors, the European Indo-Pacific Strategy, the European-Japanese Sustainable Infrastructure Finance Initiative, and the Quad. There are 20 counter mechanisms that have been unleashed in the last 5 years because of Belt and Road, right? So the truth is that the future is very, very nonlinear. But if I had to say, again, where does it settle? What is the end state? Is there any end state? That end state is unquestionably a multipolar one, not one where countries submit to a hegemon. And this is very important, maybe just a final word, because what we all have in common, those of us, whether you are from Brazil or from India, is that we are former colonized societies, colonial countries. And the most powerful psychological force in the entire world today is still the anti-colonial suspicion. And this is the one message that I take to China every time I go to China. So that if you want to be trusted, if you want to be liked, remember that everyone you're dealing with in the world, more or less, is a former European colony. And all of us, right? My parents are alive. My parents are visiting right now in Singapore. They remember the colonial era and they remember the Cold War era. And most of the leaders alive today, most of the populations today in post-colonial countries, they remember colonialism, they remember the Cold War. And the last thing that these people want, billions of people everywhere in the world, Brazilians, Indians, Vietnamese, is to have another round of hegemony, of colonialism, of imperialism. So it will not happen, right? You know, a sort of third time, colonialism, Cold War, and then China. That is not the sequence of history, because the psychological learning is so much more powerful. And that is a very, very positive force, because it's the force that says, what's best for us? We will always do what's best for us. And I want Brazil to do what's best for Brazil. I want India to do what's best for India. And for neither Brazil, nor India, nor Saudi Arabia, nor any other country is the best option, pick America, pick China. No. It's always deal with everyone and have them court you to be your friend and put yourself at the center.
Thank you, Parag. That was, very insightful, right at the end. I know that Pio, would you like to make a question or final remarks, and then we also pass to Parag for final remarks?
To reinforce Parag's point, I like to joke with my Chinese and Japanese friends that China did not invent the Belt and Road. Who invented the Belt and Road was Brazil through Vale, here present, and Nippon Steel in Japan, because when we built a railroad, we built a port, and we invented huge ships to transport iron ore to Japan, linking South America with Asia. So it's true. I mean, I hope, again, thank you very much, Parag. And I hope we sympathize very much with your views, and your inspiration continues. I mean, Tatiana, we have to develop different fronts in our Asia group to study more about Southeast Asia, the third wave, and all of this that Parag, talked about today, which is very important to Brazil. Thank you, Parag. Tatiana.
Obrigado. Thank you so much.
Yes, exactly, Pio. So I think we, especially in this, the last words, only there we have a whole or many years of research and meetings to discuss. Parag, would you like to say some final words before we close?
Oh, no, just thank you so much. We've covered the whole world in this conversation. Again, I think it's a testament to the continuity of the robustness of globalization, the adaptability that we've all demonstrated through COVID, the importance of all of this connectivity, again, as a source of resilience. And again, I applaud you for despite the fragmentation that COVID has implied, it's not necessarily as permanent as people thought. 2020 and 2021 could still be anomalies, if you will. And I think this is a great way to look to that future where we remain connected.
Thank you very
Alexandre,
much.
Alexandre, final words too.
No, just thank you all for this superb interaction, and I think we learned a lot, and look forward to, as Tatiana and Pio said, to learn more about the fourth wave and all of those new dynamic coming from the Southeast Asian country. Parag, thank you so much. Tatiana and Pio, pleasure to be with you.
Thank you
Tatiana,
for your
please.
support, Bocon. I would like to also thank Bocon again for the support to this group. Thank Parag and also Gary, Eduardo, and Pio. We had a great session, learned a lot. Not only the common sense, but a lot of provocative food for thought. Parag, and thank you very much. We hope to have you again in the future and continue this dialogue.
Delighted. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Tatiana. Bye.
And thank you
Bye,
to
Parag.
everyone that was with us.
Hope to have you back.
Yes.